many cultures, distant in place or time from our own, there are special plants that give rise to strange visions and hallucinations. Experiences we associate with illegal drugs, but which for these other cultures are thought to be a gateway to another world. For 20 years, ever since I began my career as an archaeologist and anthropologist at Oxford, I've been engaged in a search to rediscover the lost world of sacred plants. For almost nothing is known about them today. The most famous of all these hallucinogenic plants is perhaps fly agaric, a familiar red and white mushroom that has intrigued me ever since I became aware of its ancient history. Part of the same family as the death-cap toadstool, the fresh mushroom is highly poisonous, but has been used by Siberian tribes from time immemorial to induce a state of trance. And the hallucinatory effects of this mushroom are thought to have been the basis for the experiences of Alice in Wonderland. To try to uncover the mysteries of the mushroom, I assembled a group of specialists, all with their own expertise. A series of experiments was conducted that had never been previously attempted. Volunteers would, under strict medical supervision, take a controlled dose of these poisonous plants, and I would record everything that happened over the next 3 days of the experiment.
I'm sort of wondering, like, you know, what's going on? What is it making it do this? How's it working inside my mind, you know? What chemicals are these? Why do they exist at all?
What happens when these mushrooms are taken? What are their toxic effects?
Yeah, definitely happening again.
And how do the effects of the mushroom relate to their sacred status in some cultures? Hello, Joanna.
Hello, good to
Nice
meet you,
to see you.
Andrew.
And Cosmo. And Michael. Good, well, come on in. We're up in the library. As I welcomed my guests to Hammerwood Park, we began to talk of the fly agaric, the red and white mushroom we all know well from fairy tales. Yes. Well, I've been trying to get back for all those years.
Right. Well, it's a great place.
What might my guests discover about this mushroom? A mushroom that has been linked for thousands of years to a world of elves and leprechauns and other little people. The team I had assembled had very different outlooks. Cosmo Hallstrom, a consultant psychiatrist and senior lecturer at Imperial College, was interested in how the active chemicals in the mushroom affected the brain, and was well versed in the risks involved in taking hallucinogens. While Joanna Idden wanted to measure the effects of the mushroom on sensation and perception. Previously a research scientist at Cambridge, she joined us from Senna's Cognition, a company specializing in these psychological tests. And finally, I was very pleased that Michael Carmichael was able to join us. One of the few people to have made a special study of the cultural use of the fly agaric, an ethnobotanist, Michael would approach the subject from a very different perspective, giving weight to the personal experiences of those who had taken the mushroom. I began by giving my guests a brief background on this strange plant. Well, here it is, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric. That's what it looks like growing in real life, but we've also got a dried specimen here. I'm going to pass it round, but you better not handle it too much because some of the active substances can adhere to your fingers and might be accidentally ingested. The mushroom grows throughout the northern hemisphere, but the best evidence that we have for its use comes from here in the eastern part of Siberia, but there are also indications that it was used in North America. During its long history, fly agaric has often been highly prized. Some of the psychoactive elements in the mushroom are excreted into the urine. An early account of the use of fly agaric describes how poor members of the tribe would, on occasions when the mushroom was being taken, stand outside the homes of the better off with a wooden bowl to receive the urine, which they're said to have drunk with great enthusiasm. It continues to have a special place in the cultures of Siberia, where it's used by several tribes, such as the Chukchi and the Koryak, as part of the ceremonies associated with shamanism. Shamans are people with a special role in society who have special access to the spirit world and go into trance as a result of the use of this mushroom. I then moved on to the appearance of the fly agaric mushroom in our own culture. And this is the famous example from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, the caterpillar sitting on the mushroom, and Alice bites a little piece of this to get larger and smaller. So there is some evidence that Lewis Carroll himself was aware of some of the properties of eating these mushrooms and the way in which it altered perception. And so the image of the fly agaric became very common in Victorian literature, especially associated with fairies and little people sitting on mushrooms or toadstools. So nowadays, this image is one which is very widespread. Then I turn to the focus of our investigation. What is it about the effects of eating this mushroom that makes it so central to religious practices in Siberia, that seems to make the spirit world so real? And is it possible that this is what lies behind the persistent association of this mushroom in our culture with elves and fairies and little people? Well, let me turn first of all to Michael Carmichael. You've made a special study of these mushrooms. What do you think?
Andrew, I think that this mushroom represents a golden key to the doors of perception that open into a new world of experience. In fact, we have some rare footage taken in Siberia of a shaman who has used the mushrooms to transform their perception, permitting them to enter into a separate reality that is populated by a myriad of extraordinary beings or creatures that are frequently called little people, fairies, elves, leprechauns. And it's this phenomenon that correlates precisely with the European association between mushrooms and fairyland.
Cosmo, a psychiatrist's view.
Well, I think as a psychiatrist, one has to be skeptical, especially because you deal with people all day long with strange ideas and funny views. As a clinical pharmacologist, I think one gets more interested. One has to be thinking about what the mechanism can be for this action. For example, we know the active ingredient of fly agaric is muscimol, and here we have some in here. We know that muscimol potently binds to the GABA-A receptor, which is a neurotransmitter. It's a receptor, it's a chemical that's an inhibitory action in the brain. And how that then translates into people seeing little people, well, that's another question.
Already, Cosmo's scientific realism and his hypothesis of mental inhibition or distortion was in marked contrast to Michael's more subjective understanding of the mushroom as a gateway to other aspects of reality.
One of the keys to the question may be in alcoholic withdrawal. In the DTs, people typically see little things, either little mice with jackets on or a whole brass band about so tall walking around on the table. And of course we know that alcohol, again, closely acts on GABA, and you get GABA rebound. So I think we're talking about the same sort of phenomenon.
Joanna?
Perhaps if we try to look at it in relation to cognitive changes in, say, memory or attention, focused attention, we may find that it's actually in these details that we actually try and learn something about the scientific explanation for the more subjective reports.
As darkness fell on the first night, our volunteers arrived. One of them, who runs a small business in Brighton, was experienced in the use of fly agaric. Well, Ed, come in and join us. I don't think you've met Cosmo?
No.
And Joanna and Mrs. Michael. Ed, I understand that you're not unfamiliar with the nature of the fly agaric.
No, that's true.
I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your own subjective experiences of what it feels like.
It's like having the most amazing computer animation sequence running through your head. Something like that. That is what I experienced in that kind of situation.
Could you give us a description of these images, these visions?
I saw landscapes, but not landscapes that are familiar to
Is it like
the
virtual
world.
reality type experience?
With a computer animation, when you look at it, you know that it's not real. With the kind of experience I had with fly agaric, the kind of internal visualizations I was getting were very real.
We were also joined by Johnny Green, a freelance writer. For him, taking the fly agaric the following day would be a completely new experience. Well, Johnny, I suppose the question that we have in mind is, how do you feel about what we're asking you to undertake?
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. I've read a bit about sort of South American Indians and their sort of involvement with hallucinogenic plants, because I'm half Latin American, sort of reading about my culture. But apart from that, fly agaric's going to be completely new to me.
Well, I'd like to go around and ask you what you think that we're going to learn from some of the tests that we're going to carry out tomorrow with the volunteers who will be taking Amanita. Cosmo.
Well, first of all, I'm interested in seeing the quality and the nature of the subjective experience that the volunteers have and how they share it with us. But I think even more interestingly, I'm interested in seeing how that correlates with some of the physical measures, such as the EEG, the brain mapping, and the other physiological techniques that we're going to be looking at. That, for me, would be fascinating.
Yes. Michael.
I want them to help me to understand how it feels and how it seems to a human mind that is crossing over this enormous threshold between the worlds.
Joanna.
Well, I'm going to use some computerized touchscreen tests which assess different aspects of cognitive function, including perceptual ability. So as well as looking at memory and learning and attention, which I think is probably very important in the perceptual aspects.
It was not long before a fundamental disagreement developed between my guests. Cosmo and Joanna, as scientists interested in the physical and mental aspects of the mushroom, saw it as distorting the world, while Michael saw it as giving us access to new and different perceptions, new interpretations of reality.
We have a historic record going back over 3 centuries and involving reports from 30 or 40 credible witnesses that these mushrooms do in fact initiate a very extraordinary phenomenon.
Well, are you saying that taking this mushroom makes you see little things that look like fairies?
No. What it does, first of all, for anyone who takes these mushrooms, it alters their awareness, it alters their ability to perceive reality. And that is the fairyland or the outland or the otherworldly phenomenon we're talking about.
So you're really saying that taking these mushrooms allows you to see another reality. I may be somewhat slow here, but I can't see why we're not just dealing with an illusion and even an hallucination. Now, you can learn a lot from illusions, they can be very entertaining, they can tell you a lot, but they're not real. And you're talking about this being a real other world.
You said we've got to decide whether these things are actually real or whether this is actually valid. Now, that sort of terminology is not scientific. It is totally subjective. And I think we should examine the phenomenon before we try to conclude what might not exist in nature.
Cosmo later rightly reminded us of the need for medical supervision, for the mushroom is highly toxic in overdose.
I think we have to be a little bit careful about the dangers of exotic drugs.
No doubt about that.
They have side effects. They can cause mental illness if taken an overdose.
They can cause death. They can cause coma. They're extremely powerful chemicals. They could be seen, and they could be, I think, validly described as very powerful scientific instruments. And of course, they should be respected. They certainly should not be dallied with or played with or fooled with.
As the team turned in, I wondered what the next day's experiment would bring. For we were about to investigate something that had never previously undergone scientific scrutiny. Excitement was in the air as the day of the experiment began.
Yes. 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 You've got the statue, haven't you? Oh, the statue was in there, yes.
We had come to find out whether the fly agaric was part of a lost worldview in which nature is alive with spirits, and whether this might have given us the idea of little people and other mythical images. Can we recreate this world through the mushroom?
Just hit your temperature.
Our volunteers were about to take a powerful hallucinogen. Before they did, Joanna and Cosmo needed to conduct their tests on the volunteers in their normal state. This would give them a baseline level to compare with the readings taken when the fly agaric began to take hold. They recorded heart rate, body temperature, and reflexes like pupil dilation and eye movement, all of which might be dramatically altered by the effects of the plant.
And minimal vertical nystagmus.
We would also be keeping watch for any signs of toxic side effects, such as nausea, palpitations, and headaches.
Okay, so which one was it?
Joanna's computer tests would check memory, pattern recognition, and spatial perception, which indicate how competently the brain is processing information.
Okay, so for this test I'm going to show you a few examples, okay? So in this example you've got a pattern in the red box and you've got 4 patterns below, and I want you to touch the pattern in the white boxes which exactly matches the one in the red box. Okay, so which is the exact match?
That one?
Perfect. Okay, so some of them are a little harder. Eyes open.
There was also to be an electroencephalograph test.
The EEG measures the electrical activity on the surface of the brain. And so by looking at, for example, the alpha rhythm, we can detect states of consciousness and the heart rate. We're going to look at real stimuli such as flashing lights, intense smells, blindfolding someone so there's an absence of stimuli. And we are looking to see whether there are internally generated stimuli such as hallucinations, illusions, or altered states of consciousness, which may be recognized as being distinct from real external stimuli.
Both Michael and myself wanted to get a personal account from our volunteers about what was happening. Again, it was important for us first to record how they would respond in a normal state. I asked Johnny to describe a piece of music.
It's a very slow, atmospheric, regular beat, quite hard, and lots of other sounds sort of going on in the background. So there are lots of varied different types of sound, high-pitched and low-pitched. So I'm sensing it as very relaxing. It's very regular, it's almost hypnotic, very rhythmical, but quite slow and relaxing.
We took Ed to the gardens at the back of the house.
Well, I mean, it's quite an old building.
So, could you just tell us how you perceive what's in front of you?
Well, it looks like some kind of sandstone blocks, doesn't it, with a quite textured surface. Like you say, very ordered and right-angled. I mean, there are sort of different patterns within the stones, but nothing particularly striking.
Strict medical supervision was essential, and a doctor with specialist expertise would be present throughout. We all knew that every year there are at least 10 deaths from fly agaric poisoning in Europe. The fresh mushroom is always toxic and often fatal. The dried mushroom is much less toxic, but can still be dangerous in overdose. Just after 4:31, when Ed had been hooked up to the EEG machine, we were ready to begin the experiment. Ed and Johnny took a precise dose of the dried mushroom. Then we waited. "30 minutes in, something started to happen.
I'd say there's a definite sense, I don't know, for me anyway, there's like a definite sense that reality is altering slightly. Or my perception is altering slightly.
I have a definite sense of the static in the air.
I think I'm having trouble finding words to get out of my mouth at the moment. It seems like my kind of rational brain seems to be turning off.
I don't have really strong sensations. I get the odd wave where I feel, I don't know, that my touch has maybe changed slightly. Things feel slightly different, but nothing very strong yet. I do actually have quite a strange sensation. It's almost as if there's a weight, like something heavy, inside my head, just under this bit, sort of at the top, and it's being pulled up and sort of pushing my head down, and it's like, it's quite strong.
Are you feeling anxious?
No, not really.
No. Okay, let's just try your temperature.
Johnny was feeling relatively unchanged, but Cosmo's physiological test showed the mushroom was taking effect.
According to this, you have a temperature of 100.4 or 38 degrees. It's a little bit raised.
Really? What would it normally be?
37. So it's just slightly raised. Your eyes are a little bit red, aren't they? Is that they usually that colour, or are they?
Not usually.
No. So you've got injected conjunctiva.
What would be causing that?
I'm sure it's a drug effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Probably why you're warm. The blood vessels in your skin, the outer blood vessels have got a bit larger, which is probably why there's more blood going to your skin, which is why it warms up a bit.
Is that all linked with the increased heart rate?
Probably.
The
Probably.
temperature, right.
Sort of bounding circulation. You cover your eyes with our blindfold.
Cosmo had told us that people who are hallucinating may show lots of activity in the visual cortex of the brain on the EEG, even though they can't see anything.
Close your eyes.
The results of Ed's EEG tests would take several hours to process. The experiment was still in its infancy, but the effects were starting to get stronger. Ed and Johnny wanted to be outdoors.
But how long do you think it's been since we took?
I've no idea. My sense of time is completely gone, actually.
Yeah.
I've no sense.
Mine too.
Really no sense of time at all. I doubt I could even count the seconds at the moment. It just doesn't seem like there's any point in it at all.
It's almost like I'm two people in one. There's this one person that's completely sober, you know, and he's looking at you, and I'm talking to you as I was talking to you sort of half an hour ago before I took anything. But the other half sort of completely different, sort of very speedy, sort of heightened energy, you know, moving around. So I'm not torn between the two. It's quite interesting.
Reports had suggested that one of the initial effects of the fly agaric can be sedative, and indeed Johnny fell asleep. It's only on waking that the full effects of the mushroom were said to begin to take hold. For Ed, those effects were building more steadily. He was now beginning to have visual effects, and we returned to the location that we had visited earlier.
When I'm looking at the wall, it's sometimes quite hard for me to focus on the details of the wall because what's happening between me and the wall is more interesting in the air.
What's happening there?
It's like the air's come alive, it's taken on substance.
And how does it look to you?
Well, it's not even totally visible,
Yes.
but there's a big suggestion of the air being made up of much larger units which are kind of moving around in different ways and different changing shape. And sometimes when it changes shape you get sort of bars of light moving around or little pinpoints of light jumping about and lots of little patterns of lights doing interesting things. In fact, I walk my hands and oh, blimey. Just here, this layer I was talking about, this kind of blanket surrounding my head, is totally fuzzy. I can't, well, I can see through it, but it's a total blur. It's like when you've got running eyes or something, totally blurred like that. Yeah, and that's just like a layer.
You're looking at Andrew here.
Yeah.
Tell us how he looks. Does he have any surrounding phenomena?
Yeah, Andrew has a bit of a heat haze around him. It's very much like a heat haze in the desert. It's like, yeah, the air's still transparent, but it's shimmering, it's wavering around him. Mostly around his head.
Meanwhile, Johnny woke up.
It's quite strange. Not unpleasant though. Yeah, it's quite interesting to look at. I mean, it's not something you see every day when you're watching telly. I think Ed woke me up, and my visual experience was something I'm still getting. It's like, if I look at that point there, that's sort of being zipped or dragged, you know, almost like, imagine what you're seeing is a screen across my screen, so it looks like it's moving, and it's moving at sort of rhythmical intervals, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, constantly. Everything I'm looking at, apart from this sort of one corner, is moving. This is going to sound so odd, I'm tempted not to say this, but this is what the music sounds like. I can almost see the music coming out of the stereo. It's not a colour, it's just, I don't know, imagine like a car zipping by and you maybe see just a trace on the road, and then I can see it. What I'm seeing sort of zipping off, yeah, and leaving a base which is a square of grass, like a square patch of grass. And this music shoots out, rebounds, it's clear, it rebounds, then it has some dark colour, and it bounces inside the square. Does that make sense? No, of course not. But I'll explain it again.
Feeling. You're looking at the tree.
Well, yeah, grab me.
Michael was looking for echoes of ancient beliefs and religions, of empathy with nature or visions of natural spirits.
The first bird. There you are, there they are, something like that. The other birds. We know. Acknowledgement. They're asking each other what we're doing.
I think that part of the evidence might well be the fact that he was interpreting the bird song as a language of the birds, and he was in fact telling us precisely what he felt the birds were saying. He was able to interpret, to translate their conversations for us.
I'm not sure that that was going much beyond the kind of interpretation that you or I, if we'd been paying particular attention to that bird song, would also have caught with echoes of the rhythm of phrases in our own language. But it's clearly interesting that he was so sensitive to that and was responding, and his mind was putting interpretations on the sensations that were coming into it.
You know, they're just being birds. They just want to know if we're a predator or not, or what the hell we're doing here in their space. You know, they've gone quieter now. They've got used to us. The alarm's over.
That's right.
Now they're talking amongst themselves about whatever birds talk about.
By now, Cosmo had processed the results of Ed's EEG test.
Here, for example, is Ed's brain with his eyes closed and blindfolded. There's no input on the visual cortex and not a lot of activity on the back. This is entirely normal, and I'm pleased to say Ed's brain is entirely normal, but we were unable to detect any changes as a result of taking the mushroom. This may have been because we tested him too early after taking the mushroom, and it may be that our tests are not really sensitive enough to detect these very subtle changes that may be expected.
We were also looking for signs of size distortion, as described in Alice in Wonderland.
Isn't that mad? Wow. Have you ever noticed how, maybe it's just this thistle, but the pattern it makes on the ground, this thistle, is exactly the same as a spider's web. The bars going out and the branches coming across, and exactly like a spider's web.
What was interesting is that he wasn't categorizing things in terms of getting bigger or getting smaller, but there seemed to be a sort of ambiguity about size rather than a definite sensation of growth or contraction.
He does seem to be far more vague about the size of things. It has lost its importance. He did say the house was larger than it had seemed this morning. Something else was that his time, his sense of time, and the passage of time has altered radically.
Yes.
And he's made that very clear as well.
The time seems to have altered more than the sense of size.
Absolutely.
We've been asking him questions
Yes,
about
about
size,
spatiality.
and that doesn't seem to have quite the same resonance, but time certainly
Exactly.
is what has been altered and distorted in all
Indeed,
this.
indeed.
Joanna had been waiting to redo her pattern recognition test. But for Johnny, it had now acquired a new level of difficulty.
I mean, they're changing. The shape of them's changing.
That's okay.
And
That's right.
they're sort of looking like other things, shapes. So it's harder to remember what they actually are. You see what I mean?
Well, just
'Cause you're
do
looking
the
out
best
for
you
other
can,
things, yeah. I'm not bothered about getting a high score. I'm just quite
No.
interested in how the shapes change.
The distraction of the patterns moving and changing as Johnny looked at them had clearly affected his concentration. Joanna's results showed that analytical and logical processing were weakened.
I used tests from the Cantab battery, which are now used for pharmaceutical drug discovery and development. And this was a test of pattern recognition memory. And in fact, I gave this test 3 times at baseline, so pre-mushroom, 2 hours taking the mushroom, and again at 4 hours. And in fact, you can see at baseline, there was performance was 100%, so he got them all right. But in fact, at 2 hours later, in fact, his performance was slightly worse, and at 4 hours, his performance was down to 75%.
Woo! All right.
Ed now appeared to be at the peak of his experience. His burst of energy reminded me of the historical accounts of Siberian tribesmen who took the mushroom to increase their endurance.
Yeehaw! Oh, this tree doesn't go a lot higher.
The two haven't bonded dramatically.
They haven't at all. Yeah, they seem to be actually at the opposite extremes.
Living a different experience, so that remains to be seen whether things progress.
And I think perhaps Ed is very sort of into his own experiences and exploring them with some people who's interesting.
Seems to be enjoying it very much.
He does, he does.
Well, being a monkey. Where are my footfolds? Or footholds?
Ed's exuberant activity was puzzling. GABA has a predominantly sedative effect. So now Joe and Cosmo had to reassess their earlier theories.
How does that feel? It feels great, eh? I mean, I can feel the trees swaying around below me. That's quite a nice feeling.
One of the questions that we're addressing is whether this tells Muscimol or fly Agaric tells us anything about the neurotransmitter systems involved in this kind of experience. And I'm not convinced that we're seeing any GABAergic effects. We've seen nothing on the EEG.
No, nothing on the psychology.
Nothing on the psychology. No. We've seen someone falling asleep. But all the other effects could easily be explained using other neurotransmitter systems. Now, we know that fly Agaric has many different and complex chemicals, and I just wonder whether we're looking at the wrong chemicals.
Or perhaps too simplistically, yeah.
Even when it was intense this afternoon, I still felt very able to express myself.
Yeah.
It's very, very easy to express myself, eh?
I did as well. I was trying to explain how things were sort of always moving. Were you getting that as well, that swooshing?
Yeah. I was getting
I
kept trying to describe this thing of having like a layer in between me and the... It was kind of like looking out through a window at the world.
5 hours into the experiment, my guests and I concluded our tests. But I noted that our volunteers remained alert and talkative late into the night. What would we all make of what had happened the next day?
Yes, absolutely.
The next morning, we gathered for breakfast.
Very enjoyable.
Well, certainly very nice.
It was a pleasure.
So how are you feeling this morning?
Very well. Very well.
I feel great, yeah.
Yeah. How about you guys? Are you both feeling similar, or are you?
I don't know, how do you feel? I think we're feeling more similar now than we were yesterday,
actually. Are you?
In the library, we watched a recording of some of the events of the previous day.
I can almost see the music coming out of the stereo. It's not a colour, it's just, I don't know, imagine like a car zipping by and I could see things more clearly. All colours were sort of enhanced, and there are lots more differences between different colours. Like, I'd look at, all the greenness in front of me, normally just look like greenness, fields and trees, but when I looked at it yesterday, I mean, there were like so many different greens, and there are very sort of different shades of green.
Yes. Is that because you're more focused on a very specific area of your visual field?
It felt like it was because my senses were more open, and I was hearing the slightest thing, I could hear like every bird in the vicinity, and I was much more aware of what my senses were picking up.
Do you listen to a lot of music? I mean, are you aware of what sound does? I mean, when you've got a speaker going and there's an obstacle, you're aware of its bouncing back.
Yes.
So you're making use of all these things that are already in your mind, your expectations, and you're giving them visual form.
Yeah, that could be it, exactly. I mean, I do realise that sound bounces off things. You know, it comes in the form of waves.
You were being tested by Joanna on your perception.
Yeah.
And she was asking you to identify various patterns.
Yeah.
And at one point, you decided that the patterns were changing and that you no longer could participate in the test. Tell us a little bit more about what was happening, what you were seeing, and why you said that.
Yeah. The whole experience just felt quite strange and alien. Like, why were they, you know, now I can realise why they were testing, you know, whether I had sort of memory of the same shapes, but it became irrelevant because the shapes were changing in front of my eyes, you know, like a V sign sort of became like a zigzaggy line, and I don't know, blues were changing to greens slightly, and squares were turning into ovals.
The only way I could describe what it looked like is like when you're driving down a hot road and you see that heat haze on the road, that shimmering. Or, you know, you get it in the desert as well. But that's what it looked like to me, and that was fascinating. It stood out from my hand about 2 centimetres, all around my hand. When I saw it around your head, it was very distinct.
So would you say that this was a particularly powerful and important experience to you personally?
Definitely. I mean, it was a very strong experience. It's nothing like I've ever experienced. It's hard to compare it to anything else. It's like asking somebody to describe what it's like to be drunk to somebody who's never been drunk before. I mean, you can say I felt a bit dizzy, or, you know, I felt a bit ill, but you can never convey completely that sensation. And what I was feeling was like very distinct.
Reflecting on the results of the tests, it was clear that they'd been mixed. Perception had been altered, and in Ed's case, he'd experienced empathy with nature and seen auras. While Johnny's experience seemed to come from a visualization of his knowledge of sound waves. But there'd been no distortions of size, and we had not been able to account directly for the fly agaric's connection with fairies and little people. So, Michael, what do you think you've learned from what you've seen?
We've made perhaps the first short step towards a deeper understanding of the way the mind works. We've seen that a possible way of investigating the functions of the mind exists within the chemistry of the Amanita muscaria. And we've also identified two subjects who might be described as psychonauts, who at some stage could perhaps help us develop a cartography of the conscious mind.
As scientists, Joanna and Cosmo were rather more sceptical.
I think what we currently have are very good tests of memory function, for example. But what we don't have is a test of how amazing the feeling is. And I think that what I can tell you is about the nuts and bolts, which relates very closely to those feelings, but actually has an inverse relationship.
I don't think we've learnt a great deal about the brain chemistry, and I don't think we've learnt anything about little people, the other world, and dwarves and elves. And I say that because both of the boys had different experiences. None of them talked about small objects, distortions in size. None of them had, as far as I know, hallucinations and saw things that weren't there. They may have had slight distortions of perception. When we tested their distortions of perception, they were actually not even true illusions. They were false interferences with what they were seeing.
Cosmo did, however, have a theory to explain the visual effects experienced by the volunteers.
The phenomenon that I observe is the human brain is very good at pattern recognition, and if you give it one stimulus and another one, it'll very quickly make a link between the two. And usually the link is true, and we're very good at fitting patterns into the world. But when the brain is being disorganized and disinhibited, and clues are taken away from it, it'll start inventing the missing gaps.
But why do we fill those gaps differently? From my own point of view as an anthropologist, I was inclined to stress the importance of the cultural and the ritual context in which the plant is taken. The crucial thing is what you bring to these experiences, that there really isn't a sort of mechanical relationship between taking a substance and having a certain experience. What you're doing is altering your consciousness so that you feel that something different is occurring. And in a sense, this is the clue to why it's being used in ritual contexts, that what's important is undergoing the transition. So it's the expectations which determine the interpretation and determine the significance of it. It wasn't long before our different perspectives led to disagreements.
We are dealing with an extremely powerful hallucinogen. And it does alter the perception of the individual who consumes it. And that puts us in the position of dealing with what could become a very interesting, useful, and perhaps important way of investigating consciousness and the way the mind works.
People used hallucinogens in the 60s as a way of exploring the mind, and they were used therapeutically before this was put a stop to by the authorities. And a lot of patients described extremely bad experiences as a result of the therapeutic use of LSD. And of course, the current research that is taking place is to measure if and to what extent the brain is damaged permanently by taking hallucinogens. So I think one has to be slightly careful about advocating them as a therapeutic tool.
Who has been advocating them as a therapeutic tool? I don't think anyone in this group has been, and I would suggest. Oh no, absolutely wrong. This is. I want to make a crucial point here. It's very crucial right now in the history of science. There is a clear distinction. One person in this group, and perhaps others, would like to exclude an entire class of botanical and organic substances from scientific research, and I want to demur from that opinion, because I think they are very important and potentially powerful instruments for investigating the mind.
You're giving a very positive description of what you've seen, and yet from the other side, one is receiving a description which is one of disablement and impairment. How do we square these two accounts of the same experience?
From one perspective, certain functions of the mind might well be impaired, while enhancing other unmeasurable, or at least heretofore unmeasurable, functions that are still taking place within the mind, as we well know from the reports we received this weekend.
That seems to be an important item of disagreement, because...
No, I would agree with Michael, absolutely. I think what I can really report is the facts, but I fully agree that there is a whole level above that that we cannot explore because we do not, so far, have the means.
And exploring human consciousness was exactly what Michael thought we should be doing.
I think an interesting project deriving from the findings of this weekend might well be to look forward to a new wave of technology within science, which might equip us with more powerful instrumentation to examine what must be regarded as one of the most crucial issues facing civilization today.
As my guests departed, I was left to reflect on the fascinating events of the last 3 days. There's little doubt that the fly agaric dramatically affects human emotions and perceptions. In ancient societies, this could well have given reality to a belief in natural spirits. But nothing that had happened over the weekend had persuaded my guests to change their initial opinions. Those effects were a mere mental distortion or a gateway to another reality. As with our volunteers, what the scientists had derived from the experience seemed to depend on what they had brought to it. But I was in no doubt that the experiment had been worthwhile, and there were many other plants still to explore.
Powerhouse is next. The political buzz from that Westminster. Here in a sec.